Hey everyone. Yay, Facebook is actually working today. Awesome. How are you guys doing today? I am doing a little bit of a different live today. I reached out on the Facebook group and on Instagram, just asking if there are any questions for me, whether that's around health, career, coaching, my own personal life that you want to know about. And obviously, I also said, I will, if I don't feel comfortable answering something, I won't. But yeah, for the most part, I don't mind answering personal questions as well. So yeah, we're just going to be answering, well, I'm going to be answering some of these questions. And you're welcome to let me know as well, like while I am answering some of the questions that I already got ahead of time. You're also welcome to let me know any questions that you think of as we're going through this. So I will try my best to kind of answer live as we're going. But yeah, just so you know, you can still add questions if you'd like. Awesome. So I got a couple of questions and they were kind of spread out in different areas. So I thought that was really cool. So I'll get into answering those in a second. So just while I wait, if you are new to this space, I'm Sarah. I am a health and career coach and I mainly work with clinicians. So I work with also mainly women in healthcare, but yeah, healthcare providers, and often those struggling with things like feeling exhausted, feeling burnt out, struggling with their health, but also in terms of career, struggling with feeling unfulfilled or feeling like, is this it? Or I don't actually even know if this is what I want to be doing anymore. But yeah, sort of that sense of, and I'll get into this a little bit as well because that was one of the questions. But that idea of like building a career that keeps our health in the deeper sense of that word, right? Mental health, relational health, existential health, keeps our health as a top priority while we are building this incredible career. So that's what I do, and that's the capacity in which I am answering these questions. This is not like this is the truth of the universe, my answer to these questions. I'm more answering it from kind of a, let's say, behavioral standpoint, behavioral psychology, sort of a coaching viewpoint, things for you to go and reflect on, etc. Not necessarily like, this is the be all and end all truth of the universe. So just keep that in mind. There are very few universal truths. Okay, cool. So I'm going to get into some of the questions that were asked. And yeah, as I said, feel free to add questions as I go. Okay, so the one clinician gave me sort of a grouping of her questions. So the one was under more like general, and the other one was more sort of personal questions. So I'll kind of go in the order that she went in as well. Okay, so the first one was, what would you say is the most common problem experienced by clinicians? And I thought this was a really interesting question. And I think when I started to think about it, sort of more obvious things came up, like a lot of people struggle, like I said, with, feeling burnt out, feeling exhausted, feeling unfulfilled. Those are kind of more the, I guess you could say, symptoms that come up most often. But I sort of thought about it as I thought about it as there feels like more a very common underlying thing than there is that much a most common symptom. So I'll go through some of the kind of common symptom or the ways that it like presents itself or like manifests in our lives, like manifest, but manifest. But yeah, so the sort of framing of that is what they call a socialized mindset versus a self-authored mindset. So this is, I learned this from one of my coaches, Dr. Sasha Hines, who's a developmental psychologist as well as a coach. And essentially, socialized mindset is, or both of these things are different stages of our adult development. So we often think of like, children develop in these stages until this age, and then we kind of just, that's it, right? But as adults, we also go through certain developmental stages. And I always remember for her as well, her thing was always, why don't we have people helping other adults through their developmental stages, through their kind of like developing through those stages of adult development. So that's also what I sort of love to frame it as. But socialized mindset being, we are very kind of orientated outwards, right? So everything, we get our validation from external sources, right? We get our sense of self-worth from external sources. We outsource decision making to other people or Google or whatever it is, right? So there's a lot of like external things, and this can present in various different ways. So the kind of source of it is a similar thing, but then it can look different. So for some people, this is being very indecisive, right? Sometimes this is doing your career in a way that doesn't feel particularly good to you, but you feel like that's the right way to do it, or that's the way you should do it, or that's the way other people expect you to do it. It can look like an excessive worrying about what other people are going to think, or designing your life around, what other people will think. That can also look like things like being completely exhausted because you're just overgiving, because you don't feel like you can have boundaries, or you can't express your needs and desires. People pleasing, perfectionism, right? Having a very high sense of what they call like an overactive sense of responsibility, right? Where you're almost taking responsibility for everything that happens with your patients or other people, right? So if someone else tells you that they're struggling in some way, your sense is, I need to fix this. I'm responsible for this. I need to make everything right. I need to be like the peacekeeper, right? So we have an overactive sense of responsibility. So it's generally kind of this, like I said, it can appear in different ways, but it's sort of this general sense of I'm looking externally for things instead of internally. And the opposite of that, or let's say the next developmental stage that we naturally progress to, if we do this developmental work, is that one, what they call a self-authored mind. So you are authoring your own journey, right? So you are saying like, yes, this is what everyone else is telling me, this is what everyone else thinks, this is what everyone else wants from me, but this is what I'm going to do. So you're not using everybody else's thoughts and opinions and emotions to guide your actions. That doesn't mean we completely ignore other people, right? We are still compassionate human beings who need social bonds, right? We're not, just going out on our own just because we're self-authored, but it's just the source of our self-worth, the source of our validation, the source of where do we look to, where do we turn to when we're trying to make an important decision? Do we look internally at like, what do I want? What do I think? Or do we look externally and kind of outsource that? Again, it doesn't mean that you don't ask people their opinions, especially people that you really trust and that have your best interests at heart. But it's sort of just this general idea of I'm authoring this, right? I'm the author of my own story, whether that's career, life, it's all the same thing, really, anyway. But that, to me, I find I think the most common underlying thing, and then that can look like different things. Okay, cool. And I'd love to know if you sort of see yourself in any of those things. My guess is yes. And this is also why, when that's the most common problem, that tends to also be more prevalent in women. So that's also why, we end up having a lot more of those things as well. Okay, so the second question is, if you could give one piece of advice to clinicians seeking fulfillment in their careers, what would you say? And I realize now when I'm looking at this, I'm like, that's not one piece of advice. It's like one piece with like several parts to it. So I'm gonna, break the rules on that one. But I think the first thing that I just wanted to say, this is almost like a preamble to the answer to this question. But one thing that I do want to say is almost similar to what I was saying now with this like external thing. We also don't want to be outsourcing our sense of self-worth, our sense of accomplishment, our fulfillment. We don't want to outsource that to our career, right? And say, you better supply me with all of these things, right? So it's just a note that let's not put all the pressure on our fulfillment and our self-worth on our career, right? That can come from so many sources and not just our career. That being said, I think the main thing that I would say is I think it's so important that we truly design our career around various aspects of ourselves, right? So like our values, right? What do you feel like is the most important thing to you in your life? Most important things. What do you feel like is going to make the biggest difference in a patient's life? And how can you design it around that rather than this is how it should look or this is how so-and-so does it or whatever, right? I often say, like, I feel that we often copy and paste our careers or our jobs. Like, it often feels like we just look at someone else or other people within our profession and we go, okay, this seems to be kind of like what I should be doing in this career. And then we design it according to that. It's kind of like a copy and paste. We might change, like tweak, one or two details or something like that. And the way that we want to think about this is like we are not looking externally again at like what everyone else is doing and what we think we should do, but we are designing what they call like designing by first principles. So we're going back to the drawing board and we're saying, okay, what are the most important things to me? So that could be, what do I think is going to make the biggest impact on a patient's life? What is going to help them the most, right? What are my values, right? What is my personality, right? What are my personality traits? What are my strengths? What am I interested in, right? What kind of lifestyle do I want? And then putting those things, whatever you feel are the most important things, you're putting that at the center, and then everything else gets designed around that. And I want to just say, like, I think sometimes we think doing this is somehow selfish or like we're focusing on ourselves and not the patient. But like I said, firstly, one of the things is like asking yourself, what would help the patient the most and designing around that. But even outside of that, if I'm a clinician who is working according to like my zone of genius, right? Like I'm working when I have the most energy. I'm working with topics that I am so fascinated in that I would go and read about them even if this wasn't my job, right? If my values were so aligned to what I'm doing that everything, like I almost think of like your whole being is going in one direction. It's like, this is what I want to do, rather than like, I'm doing this, but like my values are telling me that, this is not really what I want. So it isn't as much in opposition as I think we sometimes think of. We think of like, what do the patients want from us? And then what do we want? But they don't have to be. And in fact, I think when clinicians are like lit up by the work that they do, they are, energized, they are interested, they are, feeling like this is how I'm going to like create the biggest impact in my career. If all that is behind their treatment, like imagine, right? Like that is a very different clinician to the clinician who's like, oh, well, I don't really want to be here, but I'm helping people. I have to help people, right? So yeah, just not having those in opposition. So yeah, the biggest thing would be, I think, like designing your career around what are the most important things. And we sort of go back a little bit to the first one, where if you think about, if I design my career around all of these things, that means I have to know all of these things, right? Like I have to know what my values are. I have to know what my personality is like. I have to know what interests me. I have to know what my strengths are, right? Like I have to find my zone of genius before I can work in my zone of genius. That doesn't mean we have to have that all figured out before we take any step, but it's just realizing that that is one of the biggest parts of it, is just getting to know ourselves and really taking that seriously, right? Like taking it seriously, the sort of self-discovery, and asking yourself questions and journaling and getting support, right? Maybe that's self-coaching, maybe that's coaching, maybe that's journaling, maybe that's therapy, right? But some sort of support in doing like the internal work to, I almost think about it as like the same way that you would work on a relationship with someone else, right? The two sort of parts of that would be you're getting to know them, and then you're creating this warm, loving, compassionate relationship. So it's the same thing with yourself. You want to get to know yourself and then develop that really nurturing, nourishing relationship with yourself. So I think that's one part of it. Like we need to know ourselves in order to design the career around ourselves. And then also, I think the second thing, again related to that socialized mindset, is often clinicians will want to do something in their career, but one of the main things stopping them is like, what are other people going to think, right? Or what do I feel like I should do? I often say this as like, we make that thing mean something that it doesn't have to, right? Like we make leaving our job mean that we are not resilient, or we are ungrateful, or we just couldn't cut it type thing. Or we have some sort of like, people are going to think X, Y, Z. And usually that's a judgment that we are judging of ourselves as well. But some kind of not some kind of barrier to designing the career that you want from a place of, what are other people going to think? What are going to be the judgments and the opinions of other people? So those can often be like the barriers to actually designing the career that you really want. So yeah, that was a lot of tips in one. But I think the main piece of advice that sort of comes from that is like taking your relationship with yourself seriously. And that might look different for different people. Okay, cool. And then the third one was, what kinds of things do you work with clinicians on? And do you see yourself ever doing group courses? So this is also another cool question. So the three main areas that I think about working with clinicians on, and obviously because I work one-on-one at the moment, it's very much adaptable to the clinician, right? I will coach with a clinician on exactly the most important things that they need to be coached on. But I sort of think about it as being in these three areas. So the first one being career path design, which is, kind of like what I was talking about now as well. Assessing your strengths, assessing your interests, your values, designing different career paths and seeing like, where do we need to go? What is the next step? How can we use all these different sort of paths to see what is missing for you in your career, and where do we need to work on it? So it's using different design or models that come from design to design this career path, and then using assessments like your strengths, your values, etc. The second sort of layer is our deep health and recovery. So like I was saying, we don't want to build this incredible career that comes at the cost of our health, right? And I don't see them as two separate things. I don't think we can build an incredible career without our health being at the top priority. But generally, as clinicians, that is also one of our top values, is our own health, or is health in general, right? So it doesn't make sense for us to be ignoring our own health when that's what we're helping other people do because we think it's so important, right? But I also think just focusing on our own health in the deep sense of that word. So not just physical health, right? But also our relationships with patients, with our loved ones, with ourselves, right? Mental health, existential health, our sense of fulfillment and purpose. So looking at our whole health, our whole deep health, right? Health in every aspect of our life. And so what I do with clinicians is like we assess the deep health at the beginning and middle and the end. But then also as we're going, we are using different tools, which can include things like nutrition, things like stress management, things like how we're sleeping, physical activity. We use those as tools to create the deepest health that we can. And sometimes that also includes, referring someone or advising that they get referred to a specialist or something, or it's advising on supplements or sleep aids or that kind of thing. So there's the layer of like deep health and recovery. And then the third is what I kind of started with, that idea of self-authorship. So that idea of building a really strong relationship with yourself, building that self-trust, building that ability to make decisions and to look internally for your own advice on whether you should do something or not. Building a very kind of strong sense of self, knowing who you are, knowing what your values are. And of course, those things can change, but we want to start with a very sort of clear sense of me and sense of self. It includes things like self-compassion, it includes things like boundaries, but it's sort of in that general framework of, as adults, we are developing from the socialized mindset to a self-authored mindset, and so that's what we also do in the coaching. And then with regards to the group coaching or group courses, I think she said, so yeah, I'd definitely be keen to do that at some stage. There's sort of like the idea of doing groups in general, so it could be like the coaching that I do now one-on-one, but just more in groups, or actually having courses. So that could be, one-on-one and you have a course sort of at the back end, or groups and you have a course as well. So there are definitely different options for the future, but at the moment it's all one-on-one coaching. Okay, awesome. Let me just take a sip of water. And I'd love to know your thoughts on the, particularly the self-authorship thing, but then also if you feel like your career has been designed, even just designed, right, and instead of like, copied and pasted, and has it been designed around you and your values, your interests, your strengths? Because we often, we sort of wake up one day and think like, is this it? Or, I'm feeling unfulfilled, or do I even want to do this? And to me, it makes a lot of sense, because if we just sort of copied and pasted it from someone else's life, why would it be tailored to us, right? Why would it feel like you? Yeah, so it's just an interesting question. Okay, cool. And then there were some personal questions from the same clinician. So she was asking, would I ever go back to being a chiropractor? These are all great questions. So, yeah. Sorry, it's like there's a lot to this question. I think most likely not. But that is part of what I wanted to kind of feel out. Like, I knew that the way that I was working and the type of chiropractic that I was doing, which is just sort of, the normal chiropractic, let's say, it just did not suit me. It isn't what I wanted to do, right? So I was clear on that much. And then I thought, you know what, if I am not practicing for a while and I start to miss it or start to want to do some form of it, then that's okay. Then that can be my next step. So I think that was the first part, is that I was quite clear on like how I didn't want to practice. So if I do decide to be a chiropractor again or decide to start practicing again, it most likely will be in a very different way than how I have been practicing. And so what I did, so I have been struggling with like career-related indecision since second year, right? It has always been a thing, and considering like every different path and option, and anyway, so this has been like a long journey, and like there's so many things that I've sort of thought about on this journey. But one of the things that I did is I felt that it was unfair. So when I started coaching, and I really loved the coaching, it got me so excited, right? But I was creating a coaching practice that was very much what I wanted to do. So I was working with the people that I wanted to work with. I was coaching on the things that excited me. I was doing everything around coaching in a way that was essentially designed, right, for me. And so I felt like it was unfair to compare what I was doing as a chiropractor, which wasn't designed. It was just sort of, it was obviously I was being employed, but even this was true even in my own practice, because I had no sense of like what I actually believed in and what I wanted, and all those things, which is again part of that career design, is like getting clear on like what we believe and what our philosophy of care is. So anyway, so I felt that the version of chiropractic that I was doing was more sort of the copy and paste that I was talking about earlier, whereas the coaching felt like I had really designed this coaching practice. So I felt like it was sort of unfair to compare these two things against each other. To me, that didn't really feel like I was comparing apples and apples or whatever. So I think that's one of the important things, is it's not necessarily the career itself, but sometimes it's just the way that we are practicing it. So what I did was I went through sort of one of the design models that I use a lot with clients, and I basically designed like what would be the most incredible version of chiropractic, right? It's like, what kind of practice could I have that I would be so excited about it? I would be fascinated with the content of it. I would love the way that I'm actually practicing. I would work with the people that I really want to work with, etc. Right? So I almost designed like, what is the best case scenario with chiropractic, and then what is the best case scenario with coaching. And I still felt like the coaching, I don't know which hand I was using for which, but I still felt like the coaching, even at the best case scenario, I still love the coaching more. And the reason for that, I think, is if I look at what I'm naturally interested in, it's more stuff that is related to like psychology, philosophy, right? I always joke like I just love having deep conversations, but like that is more what interests me than neuromusculoskeletal stuff. I did, when I was designing this like best case scenario, I also took within chiropractic, what do I find the most fascinating? And that stuff really does excite me. But if I'm comparing the two, the coaching still wins out. So that's kind of one of the models that I used. But it could be at some point that I just miss that kind of interaction or that kind of impact, or, I could combine the two, whatever it is. Like, I'm happy to change my mind and I'm happy to take the next step. That doesn't bother me at all. It did at some point. I used to feel like if I made a decision, that was it. And so obviously it became so hard to make that decision because I was putting so much pressure on that. But I really learned to accept, like, I'm doing the next best thing that I feel is right for me. And if the thing after that is not this thing, that's also fine. If I change my mind later, we're learning something at every step, and that's totally fine. That's life, right? Sorry, I feel like I got sidetracked there. But anyway, yeah, that's the point. Like, most likely, no, I will not go back to being a chiropractor. But yeah, I was sort of feeling out like, do I miss it? Do I, want to go back yet? No, not at this point, but that might change, right? Okay, cool. And then kind of related to this question, the second question under personal was, what were the signs for you that you felt like being a chiropractor full-time wasn't for you? And so again, like I've been struggling with that since, second year. But there were also other things, like for example, I am very hypermobile, so it's not ideal that I'm a manual therapist, but I don't think that that's necessarily always a barrier. Like I never had any like chronic aches and pains or anything like that. I did find seeing high volume, I did start to get more like crepitus and stuff like that, but I never had like real issues with my hypermobility, but it definitely was a consideration. Like I don't know how long I would be able to be a manual therapist, but that was almost irrelevant in the sense that I didn't enjoy that part anyway. Like that wasn't what excited me. Like if I can point to the parts of my career that I felt really excited, it was when I was learning something new. And it was, I was doing a course where it was pretty much all theory. And I was like learning these really cool concepts, or like how this thing combines with that thing, like fusing different concepts and being applied differently. And so like mentally being like creative and stimulated and stuff, that is what really excited me. I usually didn't enjoy the more sort of physical aspect of it. And for some people, that's completely the opposite way around, right? I also noticed that at varsity, it was always the sort of physical subjects that I was quite bored in. And it was the other subjects like systemic pathology and I wouldn't say biochemistry just because that was a bit traumatic, but all these other like physiology and stuff like that was always so fascinating to me. And I remember it being sort of a weird thing because people would be like, but you're a chiropractor, like, like to them it didn't make sense. Like I don't enjoy adjusting manual therapy, but somehow I, enjoy the other things. So there was always a little bit of doubt of like, is this really like what I want to be doing? But sort of, hey, Tanya, sort of like I was saying, I did sort of have different ideas of how I could practice differently that wasn't sort of the typical chiropractic, right? So when I looked at that direction, I got more excited about being a chiropractor, but certainly as a sort of typical chiropractor, that isn't what excited me at all. So yeah, the other part of it is that as an introvert, I really enjoyed the idea of working with fewer people, but to a much kind of deeper extent, like really getting to like what really matters, what is so important in the sort of development of working with this person, rather than seeing so many patients, but at a very sort of superficial level, right? So seeing that high volume, being in that high volume practice was definitely not, as an introvert, my thing, but also it emphasized the parts that I didn't enjoy, which was more the manual therapy side, and it sort of de-emphasized the stuff that I really enjoyed, which was more kind of helping patients with lifestyle, helping them with sort of the deeper things. That was really exciting to me. So I think just in general, the content of it and then the sort of daily practical things of being a chiropractor just wasn't really my thing. But I did feel like there were versions of chiropractic that maybe to a lot of people wouldn't even look like chiropractic. Like you wouldn't recognize that immediately as a chiropractic practice. It would look very different. But there were versions of chiropractic that I could see myself being excited about. So those were some of the signs for me that being a full-time chiropractor wasn't for me. And then the last one of the personal questions was, what influenced your decision to move back to SA, and did you always plan to go back? So I think one of the things is we never left with this sense that I think a lot of people do leave with, which is like, things are going badly in the country and we need to get out, right? It wasn't that kind of thing. And so the fact that the country is still struggling didn't really factor in whether we would come back. In fact, almost the opposite. It was like, yes, South Africa is struggling. That is why we are here, right? So it was more in that direction than the opposite. So I think that was one of the things. I really felt like it was important for me to be, well, my boyfriend and I both felt like it was really important to be contributing to the country. And so we almost felt like our values were a bit in conflict by being overseas. So that was one of the aspects. Before we went over, I knew that my boyfriend was unlikely to want to stay permanently overseas. For me, I had a little bit more of like, I'm not sure, I want to try it out. It was definitely like more of an option for me. So we did think that if we came back, it would be because he wanted to come back. But in the end, it was actually more because I wanted to come back. But yeah, just realizing, different things like values, our own deep health, that we wanted to be closer to our parents. And my parents are also quite a lot older than most people my age. So I knew that I don't have that much time with them left. So there was, family related reasons. And then because I was also contemplating this career switch, it created, I guess, one less barrier to doing that. So that was sort of the main reason. I remember having the sense of like, I was born in South Africa, so it was sort of my default, where I'm living by default, and I wanted to be living here on purpose. Like I wanted to have chosen that this is where I want to live, and I remember having that sense. So it does feel very different being here when I've sort of decided to be here. It feels quite different to sort of being here by default. And I'm not a particularly like spiritual person, so I don't really mean calling in the more spiritual sense, but more in the, just sort of, I guess, being connected to your values and what you find important. To me, it felt like I had, in some sense, a calling to be here and to be contributing and to be doing my work in South Africa. And again, I don't have any issues with that changing in the future, right? Like I don't feel like I'm committing now to, I have to for always think this way and have this decision. But for now, that is the decision that we made, and so happy with it. So happy with it. Okay, cool. There was one other question that I got, which was sort of to relate to each other. I struggle with saying no to tasks or things I honestly don't want to do or don't benefit me. How do I politely decline or make my boundaries clear? So I think the first thing is always so I know that the person asking this, and I have more of a sense that that they don't struggle as much with like being direct and communicating their needs or desires. But so it might be different for different people. But I almost like to think about like, what is the question behind the question, right? So for example, most of the time when someone's asking me, how do I set a boundary? What they're often asking is, how do I set a boundary and, right? So it can be things like, how do I set a boundary and make sure that the other person isn't upset with me, right? How do I set a boundary and make sure that my relationship with that person isn't going to be affected? How do I set a boundary and make sure that their opinion of me isn't negatively affected? How do I set a boundary and not feel uncomfortable about it, right? So there is often a more sort of underlying thing that we are asking about. And the first thing I just wanted to sort of start off that's related to that is there is no tip I can give or advice or, like this is how you can say it. There's no packaging that we can create that is going to guarantee a certain outcome that you want. I'm really sorry. Very rude of you. So I think that's the first thing. We just need to accept that we can't tweak everything in all these different directions to make sure to control essentially what the reaction of the other person is going to be. And that's not to say that that the packaging is not important, right? We still want to say things with compassion. We still want to say things in a way that is not, completely dismissive of what they might be feeling. So it's not that. It's not completely like, I must just say this thing and what they feel is their business, right? But it's just accepting and making sure we are aware of the fact that we can't guarantee a certain outcome when we're setting boundaries. Okay, so that being said, we can always start with things that feel often less uncomfortable for us and often are less difficult for the other person to hear. So one of those being, we can always just start with expressing how we feel, right? So this will be very different according to like who you're talking to, of course. This could be more work related, in which case you're probably less likely to tell them exactly like what you're feeling. But with a friend, you might be more, willing to, or, wanting to tell them how you feel. But we can always start with just expressing how we feel. So when X happens, this is how I feel. Or when, when you invite me to this party, whatever, I feel like you're going to be hurt by me saying no. But for me, that isn't within, my capacity, or it's just not something that I particularly enjoy. I'd rather, we met up for coffee or something like that. Can we do that, right? So sometimes we're just expressing to the person how we feel about something. The other one is just requesting, right? So that can always be the first step to setting a boundary. We don't have to immediately set a boundary. And I'll go into the difference now. But essentially, a request is me asking something of your behavior or asking something of you, right? Like, let's say, for example, you don't want to be WhatsApped at 11 p.m., right? So let's say someone is always WhatsApping you like really late into the night. The request could be, please, can you, not WhatsApp me between, let's say, 9 and 6 in the morning or whatever it is, right? Like whatever the request is, but you're asking them to change their behavior. But I just want to make it clear that that is not a boundary. So if someone does not respect that, they didn't overstep your boundary, they just didn't honor your request. And sometimes that is because they forgot, sometimes that's because they didn't care that you said it, that you requested that thing. Sometimes it's just genuinely like they do that for a while and then they go back into their own habits. But that's a request, right? I'm asking something of someone else. A boundary is more about my own behavior. So a boundary is what I will do if they still message me at 11 or 12, whatever, right? So it could be like, if you're going to message me at 11 or 12, I'm only going to reply the next morning, right? Or I'm only going to reply in the hours that I've set aside for responding to these kinds of things, regardless of when you send it to me, right? So a boundary is more a statement of, if you do X, Y, Z, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Or if you do X, I'm going to do Y, whatever. Right? So it's a statement of your own behavior. That's different to an ultimatum in the sense that an ultimatum is not trying to preserve the relationship, right? It's not like it's trying to almost get them to do a certain behavior, whereas a boundary is there to facilitate and to strengthen the relationship with someone else, right? Because you are getting pissed off and resentful and whatever because they are always messaging you so late at night. So you want to say like, okay, in order for this relationship to be okay, this is what I need to happen, or this is what I need to do. Right, so that's a boundary. A boundary is like what I'm going to do. And we can also always have an internal boundary before we have an external boundary. So if someone is always WhatsApping me late at night, right, I can say to myself, I'm going to commit to not replying to that person until the next morning. Right? So they don't even have to know about the boundary. That would be an internal boundary. And then if it needs to be expressed, if you need to have that conversation, then it becomes more an external boundary in the sense that they then are aware of what that boundary is. So there are different ways that we can do that, and different like packaging and different sort of levels of difficulty for us and the other person. But just always making sure that we know that a boundary does not have to be mean. It does not have to ruin the relationship. In fact, usually the point is that if it carries on this way, the relationship is going to be negatively affected. So we're actually being helpful to the relationship. It just often feels really uncomfortable, and sometimes the other person can be hurt. So we have the responsibility to package it in the best way that we can, to be clear on why we're doing it, to make sure that our intentions are coming from a certain place. But beyond that, we don't have control over how the person is going to react, what they're going to think of you, how upset they're going to be, etc. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, that we don't have that level of control over other people. But that is often the hardest thing for us to accept, right? Again, that overactive sense of responsibility, taking care of other people's emotional states and how they're feeling in response to your actions. And then there is also this idea of like, we never have to explain, right? So if you say no to someone, or if you say I'm not coming to this event or whatever it is, there is this idea of like no is a complete answer, and that is totally true. But there is also nuance to that, right? Because it depends a lot on your relationship with the person. Again, if it's like one of your closest friends, you might naturally explain to them what's going on, right? Whereas if it's someone else who is either, in your perception, doesn't really care about your well-being, they just have their own agenda, or it's just a very like impersonal relationship, you might more likely, just say, actually, I can't do that, I can't make it, I don't have the capacity for that, I don't have the time for that, whatever it is, without explaining further. But yeah, that also, there's so much nuance to communication, and it can change according to the relationship. But I think getting really clear on what, I guess, the intention is, and then also what are you expecting to be able to control the other person, or what they think of you and what their reaction is, etc. And just getting clear on the fact that that isn't possible, and sort of accepting that, I guess. And then we get to decide, like, how do I practice the skill of setting boundaries? How do I practice getting more and more comfortable with someone, misunderstanding me or having a certain opinion of me or being upset with me? We can always do those kinds of things in very small steps, so that we can slowly show ourselves that it is safe to do that, because often we are sort of protecting ourselves against something. We have this perceived threat when it comes to other people misunderstanding or being upset with us, or whatever the case is. So we also want to, in small steps, show ourselves that it is safe. Awesome. So I hope that was helpful. That ended up being longer than I thought. I do go on tangents sometimes, and yeah, but I love these questions, and it was really fun answering that. And yes, I will chat to you guys soon. Thanks so much for being here, and till next time.